What just to sort of ask you about the sort of the audience or the students that you work on with the sort of two briefs that you spoke about, the experimental design, and then when you go into like much more sort of structured sort of, let's say, like classical typographic concept. I don't know. Yeah. So is there a difference between the teaching method? I think you said that you take more apprentice-based practice into the other practice. So could you speak about the difference between the students and how you approach the teaching process, how you approach the...
Okay. Well, for the more structured, the screenplay project, the coming up with the typographic specifications for a book series, it's not so much about conceptualizing, big, grand, concepts. It's not about that. It's about a lot of trial and error and testing and marking up, and it's a very systematic kind of process. Whereas for the more exploratory project, I encourage students to really, the very traditional art school training of brainstorming and prototyping and, just exploring the breadth of possibilities before narrowing down and developing a chosen idea. So because the goal is very different, right? But I also, I told you about one version of this brief was to do an installation. So there wasn't really a very set kind of a brief or context of use for something like that. I remember one student brought us to the washroom to see the installation because that scene was in the washroom, right? So there wasn't a lot of parameters or constraints for that version of the brief, but I had another version of the brief where it was a poster format. I didn't show today. Or not a poster format. It has to be for a limited edition box set DVD collection, something that comes with that collection. So they had to think in that particular context. So there were constraints that they needed to think about. So there were different versions of it. But the constraint doesn't mean it's not experimental. It can still be very experimental, but they just had to operate in that particular context. So it was still about, diversifying the breadth of concepts and using metaphors and whatnot to communicate and pushing the limits of visual communication. So yeah, very different mindsets. Very different mindsets. And I think as designers, we should be able to navigate between these different approaches and mindsets. That's what design thinking is about, really. If you follow in a very linear way, that's not really so much design thinking. You need to be able to diverge. So being able to fluidly move between these different perspectives that I laid out on that slide, that's quite crucial to being a designer, really. Yeah.
It sounds like you had a lot of sort of freedom in setting the briefs and the outcomes in this context. It just sounds like that. So I think some of the issues that we face with sort of accreditation and sort of setting up is sort of making sure that certain things, at AOD we have a British, Northern University degree, and we have a certain sort of set of things that we have to cover, and then adapting those things is a challenge, I would say. So just how do you sort of package these things in the other sort of admin or other areas?
Yeah, well, I guess that has to do with the institutional culture. At Emily Carr, it's really a lot of freedom to do whatever you feel is good in the classroom, and there's almost no grade moderation. If you want to give all A's, that's okay, because assessment is not really that important. That's the institutional culture. I'm sure it's not like that now. That was a while back. Whereas at PolyU, I guess because what happens in the classroom is really up to you. I think that's that's really up to the teacher, I think, what happens on the floor. Of course, there are things that they look at, like assessment, like you cannot deviate from that syllabus. You've written your outcomes, you have to follow through. But how do you actually deliver those outcomes? There's a lot of freedom, actually. They're not going to come and say, well, Keith, you cannot do that. This is, there's some academic freedom in what happens in a classroom. So, assessments, as long as, you don't fail half of the class, you're usually fine, right? Although I did fail people, and I did get picked on in the board of examinations. Well, it's on record now. It's okay. I don't work there anymore. The dean used to say, Keith, how come your program, there's so many failed cases? And every failed case you have to justify. That's the reality of academic administration. But I stuck to it. I said, well, they don't pass. They really are not doing well. And she would say, oh, look at the other programs. How come they have so many A's? Well, because they're too lax in their grading. So I try to kind of push back a little bit in the structure to kind of defend the approach. But when it comes to really in the classroom, I don't know how other schools work. I've worked in 4, and I've had a peer review actually at Reading, but it's not really about monitoring how you do. It's about discussing issues that you might have with your peer and see how you can improve on that or figure it out. So it's very constructive. It's not like I've seen even more radical teaching approaches at different schools that they got away with. Because there is a certain degree of academic freedom, as I said. But, I've been very lucky because I was in management positions. So I could make some of these decisions. Even when I was, a young lecturer, I said to the program leader, I said, hey, I think we need to do something in the typography courses. And I was lucky enough to have a really open-minded supervisor saying, well, go for it, do it. You should do it. Because you're the expert. You should do it. I've had, the good fortune of having really good bosses and really open-minded administration who were really supportive. And in fact, my reform of the typography modules actually got me the job of the program leader after that. So I've always been very proactive in making, change around my environment, because sometimes, we typographers feel very alone in a lot of environments. If we just hide in the corner and not say anything, nothing is going to change. So, but I have also been very lucky. So, yeah.
Keith, I just want to know, because your briefs are quite creative and experimental, in the sense you have initiated...
Sorry?
No, your briefs are quite creative and experimental because you're taking your own insights into how you create the student briefs. I just want to know how long do your briefs are they delivered to the students? In the sense, is it only for a batch and then next year you change the briefs again, or how do you check the lifeline of your briefs?
Because every instance of a brief kind of tells me something in terms of teaching methods, student responses, and what they've learned. So I usually don't completely rewrite, but I kind of add things on and adjust things. I find that it's impossible to run it the exact same way every time, because it's just impossible. And I find that every instance of it is slightly different. And I see that as a process I learn from. Some projects I've run many times, more than 10 years. Some I implement once or twice, and then, oh no, actually this doesn't work so well. And then I replace it with something else. So it's always kind of like a work in progress, I guess. It's not like an unchangeable thing. You know, I get student feedback as well, right? The questionnaires. So they tell me something, or even just chatting to the students. Some students want to be very kind of explicit about requirements. Some really work better when they have more freedom. So it really depends. I mean, sometimes I understand, you know, my briefs can be very, you know, definite about constraints, because I believe constraints are very important. And I used to get criticized by other colleagues about, you know, they should be so free to do whatever they want. But no, there has to be some discipline. Otherwise, you're not really learning anything. But when it comes to, you know, a final year project, then you need to give them some freedom, because it's very self-directed. And they need to come up with a plan, but not right at the beginning, I guess. So yeah, depends on what the brief is. The constraints and the freedom would be different, yeah.
Sorry, I have another question.
Yeah.
Do you also look at the briefs you write in a collective manner with the rest of the curriculum? So you may know these briefs are more typographic based, but do you also look at the consistent pattern or something wholesome in the sense of graphic design about when you're writing that particular brief on?
If I understand correctly, do I look at other people's briefs, right? Oh, no.
Basically, this is typographic briefs.
Yeah.
For example, would you also consider how your publication briefs are done to understand what parameters should happen?
Oh, yes, yeah, definitely. Well, I think when you first start teaching, you're just very invested in the module that you've been assigned, right? And you forget about everything else. Who cares what the other classes are doing, right? So at first, I really didn't have that big picture, understanding of the connections between the different areas of learning. But eventually, I started to kind of understand the broader impact of that particular module in others. I think connections are very important. Of course, you know, more mature students, they know how to make connections, but when they're starting out, you need to, in another module, you need to remind students, hey, look at how this is connecting with the previous module. And that's something, you know, we talk about with other colleagues as well, about the connections, repeating things in other modules. So that's something that I've always discussed with my colleagues about the progression and the sequencing. And then later on, I started to design, you know, entire curricula, and that's definitely what we need to think about. How do we progress from simple to complex, and what are the different areas of learning and how they interconnect? And that's something we're going to look at this afternoon, actually, in the workshop. And then, of course, there's, you know, because I actually ran a module on curriculum design and development with master students at PolyU. So, you know, I've actually taught this before, where, you know, you have to align with the mission and vision of the university. And then in the school or the faculty, you have another set of goals and competencies. And then the program has a particular set of goals and program learning outcomes, which trickle down to the assessment task, actually. So that whole connection has to work as a system, basically. But of course, you know, that's curriculum as product is that's on an administrative level. They look at these alignments. But what happens in the classroom, you really have to, you know, on the floor and really do it, which is quite different sometimes from what it looks like on paper. But of course, you know, being an administration, you know, you need to submit these documents to the authorities and to report all of this stuff. So that's, you know, another perspective of a curriculum, I guess.
About the briefs I just wanted to ask that this is for the graphic design students, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you had any difficulties in explaining the brief to them when such briefs were given to a graphic student, because as a teacher, what I have experienced is when we give a particular brief about doing something on typography,
terminal knowledge.
Well, that's a good opportunity when you brief them to explain.
I think that it doesn't make clear sense to them that what you're trying to say is the brief.
I've had like a long queue of students, after giving out the brief and explaining it, a long queue of students kind of waiting for their turn to ask questions about the brief. So I've had that before, and I don't have a particular trick to it. Just try to use different ways to explain it to them, and I think on the first day, usually on the first day you give them a brief and then they work on it. So over time, things start to become clear. I always say to students, if you already know the answer on the first day, that's not really design. There has to be a period where it's very muddy and you don't know what you're doing, because through the process you're trying to unravel problems. I don't really have a particular trick to it. I guess I use different ways to explain, I guess, yeah, or to demonstrate, or to show examples. There are many ways. Yeah. I find coaching is quite good. Lecturing is really, for students these days, lecturing is the worst form of teaching, I think. It's the easiest for us, and it's the easiest for them, but it's not the most effective. These students are born like in the OOs now, right? After the OOs, they don't have patience. Even for 15 minutes, they don't have the patience. I'm generalizing, okay. We are, I know.
I think we are very unfair to the young people, and this trend of older generations blaming young people because they're impatient, they're ungrateful, and all that. And
I'm not saying they are ungrateful, they just need a different way of learning.
my generation is really considering the young people unfair. But especially with regard to, they get everything too easily, right? That's a disguised way to say they're ungrateful for what they get. I think we're really unfair. The difference between young people today and us when we were young is that they have the option to get to things quickly and easily.
True, yeah.
When I was 20, everything was boring and slow. If I wanted to do research, I had to get to the bus, go to the library, beg the librarian to me, do it only during office hours, go to the stupid index card thing, find the thing, wait. This was, if somebody came to me and said, you can have a screen thing, and you can say, things will magically appear, I wouldn't say, oh no, I'm going to stick with paper-based. And then somebody wouldn't, I wouldn't expect someone to say, oh, you're impatient because you want. So lectures were always inefficient and boring. But the older idea of authority, the teacher's authority, which actually nature survives quite strongly, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The teacher is the shining light that will disperse knowledge to the unwashed brains of the younger. This is nonsense. But because there's that model, then the students have to sit quiet and just absorb the knowledge, because within 1 in 10 will get it, because the other 9 will just fall asleep at the lecture. And especially if you look at this, where you get huge auditoria, just listening to someone tell you whatever. There's no questioning the teacher, there's no questioning of the method, nothing. Now we began to realize that actually we don't learn this, and we're walking it back and saying, well, maybe a seminar is a better way, or something interactive, and we label it sort of active learning, like that. Well, active learning is not a new thing. It's the only way that you actually learn something.
Yes, it's true.
Rather than just fake stuff. There is a tension there, because people like you and me and others who are educators will see that the institutions that drive for efficiency are trying to push these sort of mass ways of teaching, because lectures are cheap.
Yes.
Primarily, they're cheap. And especially if I give you my notes and then you can give them to a junior person, then they can deliver the same.
Exactly. Yeah.
And they cost half as much as I do, which is shameful.
Yeah.
But the problem is with the young people, they're fine. There's nothing wrong with them. And they have every right to demand that every minute of their attention is productive.
So the whole idea of how do we teach for people who don't have short attention spans, but they have a high appreciation of their time. I think that's the important thing. We can see this in how texts have changed. When we were, when some of us were growing up, all the books were big because the publishing model of the books was, you pay £15 and you buy something that's 400 pages. And the author stretched the damn thing out because that's the price point. Once you go into a screen thing when the length of text is invisible, what we see is that this has transformed completely the length of text. And it has completely opened up these mid-length, mid-form text, 4,000 to 7,000 words, which are a commercial non-entity, paper-based. But they're hugely successful on screen. So maybe the lesson is that people's attention and the depth of the arguments we're making fit pretty well in 4,000 to 7,000 words. They don't need 50,000 words, versus 7,000. And maybe that tells us that all these ideas of visual learning actually need to be adjusted to a sense of attention that has a high value of every minute it spends on somebody else's. So I know we agree. I just want to. It's really ironic that an old guy depends on young people, but I think young people should really expect this kind of value of their time, not accept anybody just telling them stuff. At the same time, they should expect any kind of learning environment to have this active and participatory element, because we know that collaboration and participation is much more efficient than how we I think there is a challenge in institutions because we are fighting upwards a system that tries to systematize and control everything as if it were on a spreadsheet. So there is this tension there. But I think in the end, the quality of teaching the audience, not necessarily younger people, because people now learn throughout their lives, will win out because there are increasingly cheaper ways of practicing. So if you pay to go to university, why should you pay to sit in a big auditorium with lots of people? You can just watch somebody on YouTube. So the privilege of being in an interactive environment with someone who can facilitate that kind of experience, that's what we pay for.
It's the community you pay for. It's not one sage that you pay for who talks to you. I don't believe in that at all. But I think I agree with what you said about the texts are very short now on the screen. The learning materials are very fragmented. I think the connection is ever more important because they just get this so many different sources. They just gather information from so many different sources. But there needs to be a place where they consolidate these things. And I think the studio, I don't even call it the classroom, the studio is the place to do it. And sometimes with large class sizes it's hard but peer learning is very important. They think they're paying for the teacher, but no, the teacher is only part of it. It's not really, you're not paying the teacher. You're paying for the environment, the community that you're in. And I think some of the students don't realize. They think, they get everything from the teacher, but they get more from the peers, if anything. The teacher is here to mediate the process. So But this lecture mode with PowerPoint slides, that's still a very common mode of teaching, design even. So lectures can be just recorded, pre-recorded.
Hello, thank you. I just want to quickly add to what Jerry mentioned. I have been involved in lecturing and teaching cartography and design for several years, and because of the technology just changed so fast, so I keep throwing away my old content, I just want to quickly share this, to kind of based on what Jerry mentioned. I have two sons, 16 and 13, and so when you have kids, you kind of, as management, how you raise kids, like how you treat your students in the class, you make the results, and you get your wife involved. And I just want to share quickly about my second son. He always do very well in school. Now, what happened in the school that we engaged, we enrolled in, they use a lot of laptop and online courses and all that. And I talked to a few parents, and all of them share the same thing. And the kids sitting in front of the computer doing their homework, all right, with Instagram, they have a screen, okay? They can do this multitasking, all right, and perceive art, design, information, all to be different from the way I used to do it. We are very linear, focused, but they can do this multi-focus. And my son, he did very well in his syllabus, and I said, how do you get to know this? He said, no, it's already. You know where you get it from? YouTube. So I was trying to push them to read more books. And I still believe in reading. I think that somehow that some empathy balance, that have to come in. But it's just the way they perceive information. And now I became quote-unquote less confident or less dogmatic in the way I teach my students now. So I try to change. It's all about experimentation. So I go into class, I would say, now this is the brief. You tell me how to put you to do it. And a lot of times students have got more responsibility than me. And I'm learning from them. And sometimes I feel like, hey, I'm part of it. It's a journey, journey together. They will come up with things that we never expect before. So I just thought we can share that. Young people today, they've got all these other options and they learn fast. And I'm very cool. I think we need to really rethink our things.
Definitely.
At least for me.
Yeah, I agree with you. I remember I didn't show that project, but they had to do some research on a particular typeface. And I said, you have to go to the library to check out a few books. And in the reflection, in the end, one of the students were complaining they had to go to the library, to actually go to the library and find something, and not doing it online. It shows my age. But of course, I didn't think of, we have online journals they could have checked out, or e-books, but yeah, to physically go there, she was very unhappy.
That's a concept of a library is an antiquated idea. You like the idea that there is a single building that contains all the information, because it's impossible for people to have access to this all the time. So if you leave aside archival material, so not collecting all the stuff, in reality, the thing just the content. A library is a very 19th century. Where you have an institution that controls access to information. It has a reader's card that says you can go, you cannot go, you can go, you cannot go. It has office hours. And it has a system of meeting out information that, again, is controlled through the authority of the lecturer, because they give you a book list. The book can be an empowering thing because it gives you a filter into it, but also can be a limiting thing because this is the edited version of knowledge that you need to access. Now, if you consider that the value in the knowledge is not only accessing the stuff that's recommended, but mostly in building the skills to discover information and critically evaluate. And then that means that the library is a filter that creates problems. Library is useful if access to information is difficult and needs to be maintained, also channeled. But if you say in an environment where potentially all information that's been published is available somehow digitally, then the skill that I need to build is critically filtering this myself, all the self-guided investigation, rather than access to the library. So the library then becomes a thing that stores potentially everything, and the links within the things that you mentioned earlier is the value. Maybe the links are the facilitation or the curation, rather than the text themselves. There are interesting footnotes to this. For example, when Google Books started with this extremely auspicious idea of just digitizing everything, it struck against publishers. And the idea of, quite old idea of copyright, which you were old but recently mentioned, and the business models of publishers that thought that Google Books were going to threaten
Yeah.
a lot of their income.
Yeah.
And I don't think this will come in the game because there's such a huge number of ads that are completely inaccessible, regardless whether they're copyrighted or not.
Yeah.
That even some sort of metering system
Yeah.
would have been preferable to complete inaccessibility.
Mhm.
So you have this issue of trying to provide new ways of learning. Your communities, like I mentioned, of people saying, oh, there's YouTube, that all sorts of stuff is there. And anything that's task-based, I can find better by demonstration rather than by reading about it. And at the same time, we have this very antiquated idea of institutionalized knowledge, which is not about what's good about institutions, with the curating and tutoring, but it's just the access to it. So your student is right. Because in a sense, they have to go there and spend the time to get one thing. There's an element of trust in this transaction where this is your recommendation, that's okay, but then what they're expecting to see is this link to other people is just completely impossible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, we've turned librarians not into consultants for knowledge, but into just keepers of things. Because again, if you look institutionally, people are just maintainers of the library rather than people facilitating.
Well, I guess university libraries are reinventing themselves with as a learning cluster or as a collaborative space, and
it happens in the sciences where all the subscription journals are all digital.
Yeah.
So then, yes, you could.
Yeah.
But in the humanities, it's much more different.
Yeah.
The texts are longer, they have much longer shelf lives.
Yeah.
That model doesn't work very well.
Yeah.
And still, the institutional subscriptions are a problem because if you want to get as a private individual a subscription to a scientific journal, that's too expensive for anyone.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Pew recently, the University of California recently, they just put their hands up and said they're not going to pay their subscriptions to
Science Direct, I think it was, or something like that. Yeah.
and rightly so.
Yeah.
I think, because that's a monopoly.
It is. Yeah. 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 It's definitely an exclusive club for when it comes to scientific journals. But I mean, how many design students actually read scientific journals? I mean, undergrad students. All science students do, yeah. I mean, design students, very few of them. Well, if you're not doing a PhD or master's, there are very few.
Digitize all copies of I and put them on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Or of anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.